Good morning, everybody, and welcome to The Rock. The title of my message is, It Is Enough. I wonder how many of us have said that over the last few months. It is enough, especially with the COVID. Enough is enough. I've had it, I'm out. How many times? And with the masks. How many times do people say with their masks, oh, I can't cope anymore, I can't stand it, I've had enough of it. And about lockdown, I can't do this and I can't do that. And how many times have mothers said to their children, it's enough, I've had enough. How many times? School children, I've had enough of school. I just want to go home, I want to just go and do nothing. What about the housework? How many times have we said, done enough, had enough, we've done it long enough? And about going to work. I've had enough of work, I want to retire. Never mind that you're only 30 or 40. I've had enough of that relationship. And how many times in relationships are broken down because it's enough. And we don't worry to go and mend them because we think enough is enough. And also then I get that silent treatment. Not that we do that at home, I must say. You know, it's enough of the silent treatment now. I think it's time to talk again. Enough rain, spent enough, more than enough to do. We have all used the expression, I've had enough, somewhere, someplace, or for some reason. Moses in Numbers 11 to 15, Moses hears the children of Israel complaining about how badly they think they've been treated. And Moses said to God, why have you afflicted me? Why have I not found favor in your sight? Did I forget these people, that they say to me that I'm to carry them? I'm not able to bear these people. Enough. I've had enough. It's enough to do to bear this burden. And if you treat me like this, please kill me now. He'd had enough. And verse 15 shows that God leads him. And you see, when we get to that enough, that God will step in. Jonah, oh Lord, please take my life from me. It is better for me to die than to live. He'd had enough. And how often do we feel that? Just let me die, I've had enough. The Israelites believed that suicide was an insult to God, displeasing to God, and was not an option whatever the circumstances or distressful the situation. And as they asked, so they would ask God to take their lives, as if that was a cop-out. Take my life, Lord. They ask for death. They think it is better to die than to live. And if there was another person, I'm going back to Elijah. In 1 Kings 19, we have the story of Elijah meeting with King Ahab again. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah was challenging Ahab, who did more evil than all the other kings before him. And Elijah said there was going to be no dew or rain. And this, of course, would affect the crops of the farmers and the food for the nation. And God tells him to go and stay by the brook Cherith. But that dries up. You see, it had enough. But you see, God had an answer because he tells him to go to Zarephath. And he goes there and he finds a woman, a widow, gathering sticks and says to her, please, can I have a little bit of water? And as she goes off, he says to her, and a little cake as well. And she says, I've got nothing, but I will go. And he said, well, before you make for yourself, do a little cake for me and bring it to me. He says, and then you can go back and make for yourself. Please note that. She's only got enough for her and her son. And then he says, well, go and make for me, and then you can go back and make. What was she going to make it with? You see, Elijah knew that God was the supplier. And there was a little oil and a handful of flour. And I'm gathering the sticks to prepare a meal for myself and my son that we may eat and die. How often we hear that in the Bible. And Elijah says, do not fear. Go and do as I have said. Go and do, but make that small little cake for me and bring me some water. And until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth, she did as Elijah told her. And the widow, Elijah and her son and household ate for many days. Then the bin of the flour was not dried up, nor did the jar of oil run out. God's provision in that hour when they were going to die. God's provision in Elijah's need when he needed it. You see, God all along and after all this, the widow's son becomes seriously sick and no breath's left in him. And the widow says, have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and kill my son? And Elijah says, give me your son. Give me your son. And he lays him down on his bed, goes to his room, lays him down. And the Bible tells us Elijah lay on him 3 times and breathed into him. And he asked God that the soul of the son would return. And God answers him. Hour of need. And God answers him. And the child revived. Then Elijah gave the child back to the mother. And days passed. And then God said to Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. Now it's coming back to that rain. There's been the drought, and now there's going to be the rain. And these words, because there was a severe famine in the land of Samaria. And when Elijah met Ahab, Ahab said to him, is that you, O troubler of Israel, that's called passing the buck for whatever is the problem? And Elijah replies, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, because you have forgotten the commandments of God. And when we forget the commandments of God, we are going to have the problems. And the Lord, he said, you don't follow God, you're following Baal. And then he said to the people, said to Ahab, gather the people on Mount Carmel, gather them all together, bring the people, bring the prophets that sit at Jezebel's table, bring them all, the 400 and the 450, bring to Mount Carmel. And when they were all gathered there, Elijah said to them, how long will you stand there between 2 opinions? When are you going to decide who you're going to serve? When are you going to decide? And sometimes in our lives we find that we're hovering because we don't quite, should I, shouldn't I, should I, shouldn't. But we need to follow God's word. We need to follow the word of God to know it. And you see, if we don't know it, we can't follow it. And so Elijah gathers them all up. And then he says to Ahab, bring 2 bulls. And he says, didn't say we're going to have a contest. He says, bring 2 bulls. And he says, you choose which one you want. And he says, make a fire, and I will make a fire. He says, cut up the bulls, and I will cut up the bulls. And he said, you can ask your God to send fire down. And the Bible tells us that they prayed in the morning, they prayed at noon, and they prayed at night, and they begged God, they danced, they did whatever they could to get that fire to come. But you see, it's not the true God, not the true God. And so Elijah rebuilds his altar, and he puts stones there, 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says, bring water. 3 times he said that, bring pots of water and pour over it. And how do you make a fire with stones that are wet and with bulls that have been placed on that are all wet and the wood is all wet? It's not possible. And it's all water around it. And Elijah prayed and he asked God. And God sent the fire and it burnt up the bulls, it burnt up the wood, it incinerated the stones, and the Bible says, and it licked up the water. In his hour of need, God answered that. And he cried aloud with a loud voice to his God, and God answered it. You see how faithful is God. And Elijah kept saying, come and see how good God is. And all that water that was dried up with the fire. And when that happened, the people fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God. And sometimes it needs something drastic in our lives. It needs a miracle of some kind. And he says, and then we will put our faces to the ground and say, the Lord, he is God. God no longer is hovering, they were no longer hovering between two opinions. And Elijah said, take hold of the prophets of Baal. Don't let them escape. And Elijah brought them to the Kishon Brook, and he executed them all. That's 850 people who were killed by the sword that day because they hadn't served God. And then he told Ahab to go eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain. And Ahab told his wife Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had executed all the prophets. Jezebel couldn't wait to hear what was all happening that day. And Jezebel was angry and sent to Elijah. Says, I will do to you that has been done to the prophets by this time tomorrow. And Elijah reads this, and the American Standard says he was afraid, and he rose up and ran for his life to come to Beersheba. Victory makes us all vulnerable, because we're so on the mountain, we don't see the darts coming. We need to be very careful. I'm not saying don't be happy in the victory. I'm grateful that I didn't break bones. For me, that is a victory. But you see, we need to focus on God. So often we get the victory and that's there, but all this is still going on. We need to be very careful, because the victory will make us very vulnerable. There's something about victory elates us and takes us off our guard. In chapter 19, it was a short distance from the top of Mount Carmel to the bottom of into the valley. And so often we're up on the mountains, and when we're down in the valley, that's when the trouble starts. In 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. And if we think we've got the victory, we're just something, and then we need to take heed in case we fall. Elijah runs to Beersheba, a distance of 120 miles or 193 kilometers. Until now, all that had filled Elijah's vision had been God. All that had filled his vision had been God. But then now he's on the run, because Jezebel says she's going to get him. And we need to be careful. We have God in the vision, but then the circumstances arise. And that's where we look. That's where we go. And that's where we start falling. We need to make sure that our eyes are always, always on God. And you see, if we take our eyes off God and look at the circumstances, our perspective is distorted. And if we don't keep our eyes on the source, who is God, and our courage, we look at God only as the one to protect, to provide us, and you're going to fall. You're going to have a fall. And so Elijah took those prophets. He was looking at the circumstances, he was looking at God. But one woman says to him, I'll get you. And he wasn't satisfied. And he gets to Beersheba, and then he still goes into the wilderness. He wasn't satisfied. He goes a further day, and he sits down under a juniper tree. And I should imagine by then Elijah is very tired. He's had all of this behind him. He's had all the killing of those prophets. And can you imagine 850 killed by the sword in one day? It must have been very exhausting and emotional as well. That's the way I see it. And he sits down and he prays that he might die. And he says, it's enough now, O Lord, take my life. He He's had enough. Eyes off God, eyes on the circumstances. It's enough. Eyes off God, eyes on the circumstances. And that's when we say, it's enough. I've had it. I'm turning in my prophet's badge. And when you have distorted perspective, you become dishonest. And Elijah, did he really want to die? He could have stayed where he was and just let Jezebel put the sword through him. Did he really want to die? But you see, he lost his perspective because he had looked at the circumstances. And when I look at Elijah and what he had been through and that, he was very disappointed. If you read in 1 Kings 19 verse 10, and he says, I have been very zealous for the Lord of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and seek to take my life. You see, he was very disappointed at that stage, very disappointed. Not only that, he felt he was alone. I'm alone. And how often do we feel I'm alone? How often do we feel disappointed? How often do we go through those emotions? The opposition, Ahab, Jezebel, 850 prophets, that's a lot of opposition. And he'd taken his eyes of God, who had seen him through that, and put them on the circumstances. And the responsibility of looking after everything and doing all that he did. And I'm the only one left standing. I'm the only one, Lord, who's done it. But you see, it's not you who has done it, it's God. And it's the position. You see, he was sitting under the juniper tree. He was sitting there feeling sorry for him. And God says to him, where are you? What are you doing? What are you doing? And he's saying, it's enough. And he lies down and sleeps. And the angel of the Lord touched him. I love that. The angel of the Lord didn't shake him. Elijah, wake up, what are you doing here? The Bible says gently, and that's what God does. Gently, sends messengers gently, and says, what are you doing? Arise and eat. They were concerned for his well-being. He looked, and there was a cake and a jar of water, so he ate and drank, and he lay down again. And the second time, the angel came and said to him, arise and eat, because the journey has been too great for you. And sometimes our journey is too great. Sometimes we are tired. Sometimes we are weary. And we need to take notice of that. God doesn't want you to always go. You need to take time out. And then he rose and ate again. And he said he traveled 40 days and 40 nights. And you know, when we are tired and weary, we need to take time out that we can continue that journey. And we can continue to keep going. And then the Lord passed by. Elijah was there, and the winds broke up the rocks. And the earthquake came, and the fire came, and all those dramatic. And then the still small voice. And that's what God does to us. Like that angel came and touched him. So God's still small voice comes. And you see, to be on the mountaintop is tremendously exciting. But to be in the marketplace is the place where we need to be. To be in the office is the place we need to be. In the shopping is the place we need to be. In the home, and it's there that we need to live for Jesus. That is what is needed in the world today. Yes, we can say, I've had enough. Yes, you do not measure life in terms of duration. You measure your life in terms of contribution. God provided Moses when it was hard enough. He provided for Jonah when it was hard enough. And he provided for Elijah when he fed the ravens and the brook dried up. And God provided for the widow. The prophets of Baal, God provided that they would be killed. The eyes of God, put our eyes on God and not on circumstances. Then you will not be saying, it's enough. Keep your eyes on God. You will be saying, Lord, give me more.